Let's talk about what's actually happening in the Gulf right now, because the noise is loud and the signal is thin. And most of what you're being fed today is going to be wrong by tomorrow morning. Here's where we are. American strikes hit Iranian territory again this week. Bushehr, Chabahar, an airport at Iran Shahar, and the number being thrown around is somewhere near 90 targets. Air defense systems, drone storage, missile infrastructure. Iran didn't sit on its hands. Within hours, sirens were going off in Kuwait and Bahrain. Missiles and drones were intercepted over Jordan. A tanker was burning off the coast of Oman. This is not a rumor. This is not one commentator's guess dressed up as news. This is the shape of the last 72 hours, confirmed by multiple wire services, and it is a serious deterioration of what had been, until a few days ago, a shaky but real ceasefire. Now, the instinct when you watch something like this unfold in real time is to try to name a single villain and a single motive. I want to resist that instinct for a minute, because the actual picture is messier and more interesting than the villain's story. And if you understand the mess, you'll actually be able to predict what happens next better than if you just pick a side and cheer. Start with the trigger. Iran hit 3 ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Not through the corridor Tehran has declared its approved route, but along a path closer to the Omani coast. One of them, a gas tanker, caught fire. The other 2 took damage but kept moving. Within a day, Washington had revoked the license that let Iran sell oil openly on the world market for dollars. A genuine concession that had been sitting at the center of the interim deal, and launched a new wave of strikes. Iran responded by hitting American positions in Kuwait and Bahrain, then fired ballistic missiles at a Jordanian airbase. All of it intercepted, as far as we know, with only minor injuries from falling debris. But intercepted missiles still tell you something. They tell you both sides are now willing to fire directly at each other's regional footprint, not just trade strikes on Iranian soil and call it even. So what is this really about? I'd suggest it's less a resumption of total war and more a fight over who controls the choke point. Iran has effectively been saying, we will guarantee the safety of ships that use our approved corridor through the strait, and anyone who doesn't use it is fair game. The United States and the Gulf states are saying, there will be no toll, no approved corridor, no permission structure. Freedom of navigation is not something Iran gets to sell. That's a different argument than, does Iran still have the capacity to fight? It's an argument about sovereignty over a choke point that carries something like 1/5 of the world's traded oil and gas in peacetime. And choke point fights have a long, ugly history of dragging on far past the point where either side can articulate what winning would look like. Which brings me to the question nobody in Washington seems to want to answer out loud. What is the actual objective here? Not the tactical objective, degrade this radar, destroy that missile battery, but the political one. If the goal was regime change, that door mostly closed months ago. If the goal is just attrition, just making Iran bleed until it can't fight anymore, that's a strategy that assumes American stockpiles and American public patience are more durable than Iranian resolve. And that's not a safe assumption. The US Navy itself has acknowledged, in public testimony, that it has more missile launch tubes than missiles to put in them. That's not a small detail. That's the kind of admission that tells you a military campaign is running on inventory math, not on strategy. And here's the historical pattern worth sitting with for a second, because it rhymes uncomfortably with 1914. In the years before the First World War, there was a railway, Berlin to Baghdad, that the British Empire treated as an existential threat, not because the railway itself was going to conquer anyone, but because it represented an alternative to British control of the sea lanes. Land routes that bypassed the Royal Navy's chokehold were, to London, as dangerous as a fleet. You don't need me to draw the parallel too tightly, but it's there. Overland routes that bypass naval choke points have always terrified whoever holds the choke point. China's Belt and Road runs straight through Iran, and there was a strike this week on a rail link in Golestan province, connecting Iranian rail to the Central Asian network toward China. Modest damage, not the kind of hit that changes the strategic picture, but strikes like that are rarely about the physical target. They're a message. In this case, probably a message to Beijing: we can reach the infrastructure that matters to you, even the infrastructure 1,000 miles from any front line. Whether that message lands the way Washington hopes is a different question entirely. China has a functioning relationship with Iran built on oil and a shared interest in not being dependent on sea lanes patrolled by the US Navy. A single damaged rail bridge, repaired in a matter of weeks, is not going to unwind that relationship. If anything, it reinforces exactly why Beijing wants redundant land routes in the first place, because someone might hit the first one. Now let's talk about the states caught in the middle, because Bahrain and Kuwait did not choose this fight. They're small, they host American bases, and that hosting arrangement has just made them targets in a conflict they have almost no ability to shape. There was speculation in the first hours after this round of strikes that Gulf states themselves might have launched an attack on Iran, a deterrence play, trying to signal, leave us alone, by hitting first. It's worth being honest about why that theory doesn't hold up well. These are tiny states with limited independent strike capability, hosting a superpower's military infrastructure, surrounded by a much larger power with a demonstrated willingness to retaliate against exactly this kind of provocation. A small state doesn't usually pick a fight with a much larger neighbor by throwing the first punch, unless it's got serious backing lined up in advance. What's far more consistent with the evidence is simpler and less dramatic. American strikes triggered Iranian retaliation against the bases these countries host. And the fog of a fast-moving news cycle, state media claims, denials, contradictory reports within the same hour made it briefly look like something it wasn't. That confusion, by the way, is the norm in the first hours of any exchange like this, not the exception. The first report out of any strike is usually wrong in some material way. And that's true whether you're talking about this week's confusion in the Gulf or events in wars going back generations. Fog doesn't discriminate by century. Let's widen the lens, because this didn't happen in isolation. This flared up in the middle of the funeral of Iran's supreme leader, who was killed earlier this year in strikes attributed to the US and Israel. That timing was not incidental to how it was received inside Iran. Attacking during the mourning period for the country's highest religious authority is the kind of thing that hardens opposition rather than intimidates it. A population that might otherwise be exhausted by war can find fresh unity in a moment of grief. If the working theory in some policy circles is that enough pressure eventually produces capitulation, the funeral timing argues against that theory rather than for it. And this is happening while the American president is at a NATO summit in Turkey, which adds its own layer of complication, because Turkey is playing a genuinely fascinating double game right now. Ankara is being courted with the possible sale of F-35 fighter jets, a sale Israel has lobbied hard against for years. At the exact moment, Israeli officials are using startlingly hostile language about Turkey, some of it explicitly comparing Erdogan's government to the Iranian regime as an existential threat. That's a real split, not a manufactured one. Washington seems to be trying to buy Turkish neutrality, stay out of any wider war, and in exchange, get access to advanced weapon systems and warmer treatment. Whether that bribe holds depends less on what Erdogan says publicly and more on Turkish domestic opinion, which by most accounts runs strongly sympathetic to the Palestinian and broader Muslim world side of these conflicts. A leader that popular and that shrewd doesn't hand over his negotiating leverage for a jet sale. He takes the jets and keeps his options open. There's also a live question about Syria and Lebanon in all of this, whether Turkish influence over Damascus might be leveraged to push the Syrian government into some kind of confrontation along the Lebanese border. I treat that one with real skepticism. A government still consolidating control over its own territory, still managing an unstable border with Israel and complicated relations with Kurdish forces, does not have the bandwidth to open a second front to please an outside patron. Promises of cooperation in that kind of relationship tend to be vague, deniable, and mostly symbolic. Now, the harder question, the one that actually determines where this goes, can the United States sustain an open-ended confrontation like this? And here the answer leans toward no, for reasons that have nothing to do with battlefield performance and everything to do with balance sheets. Oil was sitting around $78 a barrel before this latest round, and there's a reasonable case it moves substantially higher if the strait stays contested, the kind of price level that feeds directly into inflation that was already running hot across the Western world. Watch the 10-year Treasury yield, not the battlefield maps, if you want to know how much runway this war really has. Every serious voice in that market has been saying some version of the same thing for months. Cross a certain threshold on borrowing costs, and you're not managing a war anymore, you're managing a financial crisis that happens to have a war attached to it. Add to that the plain fact that both Iran and, by most assessments, Russia have moved towards something closer to full wartime mobilization. Industrial base, population, messaging, all oriented around sustained conflict, while the United States has not made that shift at all. Committing a fraction of naval and air assets to an open-ended campaign while your adversary mobilizes completely is a mismatch that tends to resolve in favor of whoever actually organized for the long fight. History's verdict on staying power being fairly unsentimental on that point. There's a domestic political layer sitting underneath all of this that's worth naming plainly, because it explains behavior that otherwise looks contradictory. There's a reading, and it's a contested one, so take it as one interpretation among several rather than settled fact, that continuing a hard line against Iran serves a president's domestic coalition building more than it serves any coherent regional strategy. That the political costs of appearing to back down are, in this view, higher than the costs of continued military action, especially heading into a midterm cycle where alienating a well-organized and well-funded political base could cost more than any battlefield setback. Other observers push back hard on that framing, arguing it overstates the influence of any single domestic lobby and understates genuine strategic calculations inside the administration about deterrence and credibility. I'd flag both readings and let you weigh them, because the honest answer is that we don't have full visibility into which motive is actually driving decisions at any given moment, probably some blend of both. What we can say with more confidence is the pattern of escalation itself. Promising de-escalation in one breath, there was a real moment where a ceasefire framework got signed and briefly held, and then reversing course days later toward more strikes, more targets, harder rhetoric. That inconsistency is its own kind of signal. It suggests a policy being made reactively, strike by strike, rather than one following a settled endgame. And a war run reactively, without an agreed destination, is exactly the kind of war that grinds on longer than anyone intended, because nobody involved can articulate the conditions under which they'd stop. One more thread, because it's connected whether people want to admit it or not. The parallel escalation in Ukraine. The same week as this Gulf flare-up, there's been a green light reported, not yet fully confirmed in every detail, for deeper Ukrainian strikes into Russian territory, hitting refineries, alongside renewed talk of licensing Patriot missile production inside Ukraine itself. On paper, that sounds like it strengthens Ukraine's hand. In practice, building that kind of production capacity takes years, not months, and any factory stood up for that purpose becomes an immediate target the moment it's identified. Which raises an uncomfortable question about whether that announcement is a real capability shift or mostly a signal aimed at persuading skeptics in Washington that the war is still winnable. The two fronts, Iran and Ukraine, aren't the same conflict, but they share a common thread: escalatory decisions being framed publicly as paths toward negotiation, when historically, escalation and negotiation tend to pull in opposite directions rather than the same one. So where does this call? I don't think anyone serious is looking at a negotiated settlement in the near term, not with Tehran declaring in public that it won't fold, and not with Washington unwilling to state a clear political objective that stops short of Iran's total capitulation. What's more likely, based on the financial pressure building underneath all of this, is that the war ends the way empires typically wind down commitments they can no longer afford, not through a signed agreement, but through a slow accumulation of pressure, rising borrowing costs, rising oil prices, allied frustration, domestic political exhaustion that eventually forces a quiet withdrawal dressed up as something else. That's the pattern history tends to favor over the tidy diplomatic ending everyone keeps hoping for. Great powers rarely leave commitments like this through negotiation. They leave because they run out of money to stay. And then, often quite suddenly, the withdrawal looks inevitable in hindsight, even though almost nobody predicted its timing in advance. Keep watching the Strait, keep watching the bond market, and treat the first report out of any single strike with real caution. Because in a conflict with this many parties, this much fog, and this little agreement on what victory even means, the confident narrative you hear in the first hour is almost never the one that holds up by morning.